Hi everyone. You able to hear me okay? Great. Oh yeah, look, you were early. Nice. All right, let's go ahead and get started. So we'll start with just a couple of course logistics things. Most importantly, exam 2 is due tonight, so be sure to finish that up and get it in tonight before midnight on Canvas. Are there any questions about exam 2? I've seen a couple of people have submitted it, so. Oh, okay, good, there's a question. Let's see. In questions 3 and 4, do we need to sketch a low fidelity prototype or explain the low fidelity prototype's purpose? Has 6 points. How long should the answer be? So you don't need to sketch it. If you want to sketch it out, that's fine. You can write a description of what the low fidelity prototype would be like. Oh, it'll be index cards with this and that, and this is how we'll use them as a prototype. Your answer doesn't have to be super long there. Just enough to describe the prototype fidelity. That's a good question. Other questions? Oh, okay, another one. Okay, so when we have a robotic bartender prototype design, should we talk about a mobile app for the bartender robot, or talk about the hardware of the robotic bartender, or the station app design? So you can really choose any of those. I would probably focus more on either the mobile app or the kind of kiosk station design and talking about that. But you could definitely discuss, how the robotic hardware might be involved in that. So if you're, thinking about ways it's going to deliver a drink or something, you might say like, oh, I've got a counter set up with, numbers in different areas or something, whatever is relevant to the design. But probably focus most on the software side of it. It's a good question. Anything else? How do I want number 9 answered? Let me see what number 9 is. I want it answered correctly. That's probably. Let's see. Okay, so number 9 is the designing a study for 2 versions. So for that, just be sure that you address the numbered items there, what you would measure, how you would analyze the results, and any potential confounds or biases that might exist. So it doesn't have to be a super detailed or lengthy answer, but you would need to describe kind of how you would set up your study, and then what you would measure and how you would look, what results you would get and how you would analyze those. So what they would mean if they came out one way or the other. Is that helpful? Is compare and contrast okay? Yeah, that would be fine. So it's up to you. So the question is just that you've got these 2 versions to compare. So it's up to you to decide, like, if you want it to be within participants where a person would try both versions of it, or if you want it to be where a person only sees one version of it. Those details are up to you. So yeah, however you want to do it. It's kind of lots of right answers as long as you kind of address these points. It's a good question. Any other questions? Okay. If you have questions, throw them in the chat as we go, and I will. Yes, okay. How detailed does number 7 need to be? Let me see. Number 7. Okay, so 7 is the design task. So it doesn't have to be incredibly detailed and polished. Like I said, it doesn't have to be artistically a masterpiece, but it needs to have at least the functions that are described. So placing an order, tracking a status of an order, and seeing past orders. Those all need to be represented, and then there needs to be some interactive element to the prototype. So even if that's just clicking on tabs and it navigates to the page of past orders or current orders, you can kind of you're free to go as far as you want to make it a nice polished design, but as long as it captures the concepts and shows the user flow, then that's perfectly fine. Okay. If you have other questions, just let me know and I will get to them. So let me go ahead and transition. Quick announcement. I just saw this before class. So Adobe's having their Max conference right now where they update all of their Adobe things. And XD has some updates available. So it seems like the main thing they're pushing is this 3D transforms. So everyone should, if you're using XD, go make 3D transforms. It's kind of interesting, but there's a few other features that didn't seem that great. Anyways, and before we get started, I am working to get you all feedback on your projects. So I'm hoping to get that all done tonight, and I'll post it on Canvas. That'll be my feedback and then the peer feedback from the peer evaluations. I know that I owe you guys several things that are in the grading queue right now, so I'm trying to get through those over the next couple of days. So we'll talk more about kind of what's next on the project path on Thursday. But I'll try to get everybody feedback by tonight. Just have to go through all of the projects, and there are a lot of them. But they're very good. So overall, everybody is doing a good job. So, all right. Last time we talked a little bit about visualization of study data or just data kind of out in the wild, and how to make sense of that and good and bad visualizations. And then we started on social HCI. So these are just some of the high points of visualizations that we talked about, just that they're helpful to explore data and see what's going on, to find weird patterns and kind of investigate further. Pointing you to a couple of examples of good visualizations. So you'll get a chance to do some visualizations on the third exam. That's kind of the main part of it. We'll be doing some visuals, but we can think about that later. And then we started talking about social HCI. And that's where we're gonna jump back into social HCI today. We're gonna finish that up, and then we're going to look at AI and machine learning and how that relates to HCI. So let's go ahead and get back into social HCI. So kind of started off by saying, obviously humans are social, spend a good amount of their time engaged in social activities, and we kind of introduced this idea of technology mediating social interactions. And so I'm going to use the word social computing some today. That's not anything super special. That's kind of just referring to using computing for social reasons or having it mediate social interactions in some way. So some of the topics that we talked about last time, we began by talking about facilitating social interactions, with technology. So whether that's something face-to-face or something remote. We talked about kind of all of the different aspects of communication when people speak face-to-face and how it's quite an involved and detailed thing. But luckily we have a lot of data about that. We've had social scientists who've studied people and observed patterns and behaviors and quantified and described all of that for us. And that's helpful when we start to design things that interact with that process. So we had started to talk about remote interactions using technology, so text, audio, video, and we'll pick up there, and then we'll talk a little bit about telepresence, social media networks, and then co-presence, and then we'll talk about social agency of machines. So let's jump back into remote conversations. So there's a lot of research in this area of supporting people having a conversation with each other when they're physically separated, physically at a distance. So some of the historic ways we've done that, we've had just writing letters, more modern emails or text messaging, audio calls, video calls, all of these things that somewhat mimic conversation that you would have face-to-face, but also usually add something or constrain something in the process. So we talked about some of the common examples that we see today that most people are familiar with. So things like Skype, FaceTime, Zoom, being video chat applications that are kind of available widely. And we discussed a little bit about kind of that visual channel obviously adds a dimension to the audio channel, and that can be both good and bad. And that there's things to think about. This example here of so young children, it can be especially helpful to have a video feed, so you can kind of see that nonverbal channel, and so that's helpful in comparison to just the audio feed. So then we started to talk about kind of something that goes beyond just the person-to-person or small group-to-small group conversation, and that's looking at social networks, which have seen widespread adoption and are used widely. So kind of one of the major examples is Twitter. Twitter is used for a ton of things today, and it often breaks news. It's used to gather data about maybe how people feel about something, or to see who's affected by a disaster or a storm or all kinds of things. And then we started to talk about how social networks are a little bit different in that they tend to, most of them, and we'll go into a little more detail today, tend to allow you to broadcast out to a broader group, and that they're kind of subject to inaccuracies, biases, and just straight up attacks in terms of people spreading information that's maybe not true or that's not fully informed, and certainly in the past few years that's been kind of a major mainstream issue that people have discussed, and looking at how these networks distribute information and how they should behave within kind of society. So last time I mentioned this story about Twitter had imposed, and Facebook as well, some blocking on a particular New York Post story that's related to Joe Biden. And since we talked last, I believe Twitter at least has completely reversed their stance on this. So they kind of took a strong approach to banning this particular article, and then they kind of, they got a lot of pushback for that. Obviously, this is in a political context in an election year in the U.S., so it's kind of the worst of everything coming at them. But this is kind of really taps into that thing that we've seen, so many people focused on, whether people in news media or people in government, about the content that's shared on these social networks. And how that should be moderated or regulated. And I suppose we'll continue to see that process play out. And that's an interesting, that's a place where HCI is very much at kind of the intersection of these very important societal issues. So you start to have not only kind of ethical and moral things come into this, but also the legal side of things. So if you're looking at the U.S. context, right, you got to take into consideration what laws apply, what constitutional rights might be impacted by some of these choices. So this is obviously people could, without technology or computation, could find a way to do things, spread information like this. But definitely in this case, the technology is a huge facilitator of making this possible. And so that kind of puts it into the realm of something that people who design technology like this need to think about. And so, kind of what that looks like for HCI, like in practice, is, think about some of the social media networks that now they'll do fact checking on, an article that someone shares, right? And if it meets certain conditions, based on however they do their fact checking, they may apply a label to it. They might add an element in the user interface to alert people that, our fact checkers, think this information is not accurate, or maybe you should look at this too and consider it with it. And we've seen a lot of kind of iteration and approach development in that area over the past few years as these social networks really take on this area. And what's the best way to do that? So in terms of a user engaging with your interface, how do you tell someone that the thing they're about to share you're assessing it to not be true, or you want to urge them not to share it? What effect does it have depending on the way you do that, right? And we've definitely seen reactions from both users who have been affected, by things like that, and users who see things like that. When you see something posted and you see that kind of editorial information has come in from the platform or the interface, people certainly have a reaction to that, and it's kind of become a big area, and so it's interesting to see the different approaches that have been taken, and it's something that I don't think we're anywhere near an answer, or that will necessarily ever be near an answer. But we certainly are evolving our approaches and how we deal with that kind of thing. So I think this is where we left off last time. We were going to talk about a study that Facebook did, I think in 2014, and so you can see the headlines here of Facebook emotion study breached ethical guidelines, deliberately made people sad, and so this was an article that Facebook published in one of the bigger social science journals, and it got a lot of backlash. So this was in 2014, and I remember this happening, and it was really upsetting to me as somebody who does social science research, the way that this played out. So to give you kind of a high-level summary of what happened, Facebook wanted to see if they could manipulate, they wanted to see if they could have this concept of emotional contagion, is how they described it. So what they did was they selectively manipulated people's news feeds to have more or less emotional content, and negative or positive posts, basically. And then they looked at what people posted and how they behaved in each of these conditions. And they found that they were able to actually have people kind of post more negative things, or to be in more of a negative state when they kind of flooded them with just the negative, and then the opposite with the positive. And kind of the big outrage here with this was that Facebook didn't tell any of their users that they were manipulating their feed in this way for this purpose. And at first you kind of think, well, okay, Facebook, they have this feed of activity that's happening. How they arrange it, that's their business. But So they said that the terms of service that they have with any user is enough to protect them. So to give you an idea, if we wanted to do this study, like at a university lab or something, we'd have to go through an ethical review, and it would be problematic that we're going to try to make people sad or unhappy. And we'd have to talk about a way, how are we going to mitigate the risk, or how are we going to make sure that there's not too much harm to anyone in this study. And so a lot of the kind of the upsetting part of this was that Facebook didn't do that. They just said that their terms of service were enough and that they didn't have to do the ethical review. So the question, why did Facebook conduct and publish the article? So Facebook does a lot of research. They do research on a ton of things that you wouldn't even imagine. But in this case, this was just one of their research projects looking at how emotion can spread through social networks. And so from a business perspective, I'm not entirely sure what they would hope to gain from this. I'm sure there are things that this is useful for, but they do, with their research, the people who work there who do the research like to publish their work, and that's something that Facebook does, and a lot of companies do. But in this one, they were also working with a university, collaborating on this project. So yeah, it's just kind of a regular thing that they would do, is to publish this kind of work. Now I don't know if they realized how controversial this would be, and we've kind of largely moved on from it at this point. But it is, it's something worth noting, right? So Facebook, being software that's able to have an emotional effect on people, is able to moderate how people feel and influence kind of the social interactions that they're having. So definitely you kind of see that these platforms do have social power, and that they can manipulate things if they'd like to, which is interesting. So just to talk a little bit more broadly about what we'll call social network sites. So sometimes in literature you'll see just any kind of social network, Twitter or Facebook or Instagram, Snapchat, whatever. They fall under this category as just a SNS, a social network site. So some of the questions that we're interested in from an HCI perspective, one big one is, how does use of these platforms affect people's interactions, face-to-face interactions? Are people more or less likely to interact face-to-face when they have these platforms available? Do they, do this in addition to their normal interactions? Things like that. And so, kind of spoiler alert here, when we talk about the effects of social networks on people, there are studies and data usually to support both sides of the picture, to say that they're both harmful or helpful. So that's good. People are still investigating it and trying to fully detail it, and there are upsides and downsides as far as we can tell to using these platforms. So, for example, this next question of how does social network use affect well-being? So, kind of an interesting study, and this is just from one article. So you could probably find other data that may say kind of the same thing, or may give you something else to think about. But this article looked at the difference between composed and targeted communication. So like if you use like the Messenger app or something to have a conversation with somebody, and it's a very one-to-one, very interactive communication with them over a platform, then that's generally has a positive effect on people's well-being. Whereas if you spend more time just doing kind of wide broadcast, like say you're going to tweet something out to the world, and you only get, you might get heart feedback, or you might just consume things that were broadcast and provide that one-click kind of feedback. That actually, if you kind of spend all of your time doing that, that tends to be a little bit more harmful for well-being. So that's kind of an interesting way to divide it and look at the effects. Another question we see is there's this idea of a filter bubble, right? And that people using the different social platforms, either through the AI or the machine learning or just through the connections that they have, kind of create their own landscape and are in this bubble of only receiving tailored news that fits them. They don't hear things that are outside of their viewpoint or outside of their interest, their connections. And there have been a lot of studies into this, and kind of some of the details of it matter. So in general, there's a pretty recent study showing that in general, people using the social networks do get a varied online news diet. Now you have to take into consideration what we're comparing that to. Is, compared to what they would get news online if they weren't using the social networks. And of course, individual results vary here. But on average, this kind of recent study is showing that it's more varied than we thought. But there's also the finding that the user's own choices tend to play a larger role than any recommendation algorithm or any feed algorithm. So like whatever Facebook's doing to decide what to show you, in shaping kind of what you're exposed to. So that's not necessarily, it could be that the social networks themselves do reduce the diversity of the news you're exposed to in comparison to, say, I don't know, like watching a news broadcast or reading like a newspaper website or an actual newspaper. But in this case, when we investigate the question of specifically the algorithms, we find that they don't play as large a role as the user themselves. So that's kind of good. So another aspect related to social networks is this online disinhibition effect. And so this is kind of the concept that we are familiar with, that when people are online, they're kind of, depending on what the platform is, and certainly if they're anonymous, it can lead to more just expression, self-disclosure, especially if that's not linked to their identity necessarily. They're more likely to take actions that they might not take in the real world. We certainly see this come up when we deal with antisocial behaviors online, so any kind of harassment online or anything like that, trolling or flaming or kind of whatever aggressions you want to talk about that occur primarily or originate on virtual platforms. This effect is at play when that's going on. So people are, at least somewhat it seems, kind of recognized being disconnected and connected in a way that's different from kind of face-to-face interactions or real-world interactions, I guess. And that's certainly, like I said, it really becomes the case when their identity, they don't perceive their identity to be linked to their actions. So that's something to think about too, in terms of when we design software or hardware that's going to facilitate social connections. So I want to move on from the social networks and start to look at telepresence. So when we think about telepresence, these are any kind of technology that's focused on making a person feel more like they're in a remote location and allowing communication to occur. So that can be as simple as a video chat kind of thing, or that can become more involved in terms of doing something like VR, or looking at having an embodied robot that allows them to move through the environment physically, or combining video feeds to show people in a shared space when they're actually in remote areas. So this is kind of the area that we consider telepresence. This is an example of just kind of one of the classic business examples of a Cisco telepresence conference room. And the idea here is that you kind of, you've got like half a table, and then you've got all these screens, right? And then the other people have the other half of the table, and it's meant to make you feel like you're sitting, across from each other in a meeting at this table from remote locations. And so you can see this is a lot of specialized hardware and software to make this happen, to try to improve the realism of being somewhere else. I'll show you another example. This is from the late 90s. This is called Hypermirror, and it's a system that some researchers created to create a shared virtual space. So the idea is that you look at a screen and it's like looking at a mirror, but it has added into it, composited in the people at the other remote location, and vice versa. So they, you all see each other on each other's mirror. Okay, so you can see in this top picture that you see 3 people in that picture, and then on the bottom picture you see a 4th person standing there who's not actually at that location, but is being composited in. So I'll show you a quick video of a modern example of this.
Okay, have you actually come here? Hey, Dad. You can see from there on front. Do something. Wait, I want to punch you in the face, Papa. Papa, I want to punch you in the face, okay? I just hit your head, Papa. Papa, when I hit you, go flying, okay?
Go stand there.
So that's just an example of kind of the whole concept. That's what the Hypermirror system did. That's like a museum installation version or something. That's just someone's video off of YouTube. But I think it's a nice example because it shows you kind of how people will go about using the system, and immediately wanting to kind of do the thing that you really can't do, which is to interact with each other because they're in different locations, right? So they're trying to punch each other or whatever. And that's kind of where you run up against these boundaries on the technology, right? You start to see that you've got this image and it may overlap in ways that don't make sense spatially, and that you can't actually have the physical interaction that it might encourage. So it's kind of an interesting example that's quite old at this point, but is one idea about kind of bringing people together remotely. So this is another early example. This is BiReality, and this is a robot. So you can see here on the left, that's the robotic platform itself. It's pretty tall, pretty big, and it's got screens on each side of it that are showing the remote person's face, and the remote person stands inside of this what they call the display cube, and they've got screens all around them showing kind of what the robot is seeing wherever it's at. So they feel very embodied, right? Like they're moving through that environment and communicating with whoever's on the other side. So that was an early example. Now we see commercial products. So this is a little less immersive, right? This is pretty much video chat with wheels. This is a Beam robot, and kind of the same idea. So you start to have to design for things like how can you make the remote user aware of their surroundings more, things that you might not think about until you use it for the first time. So something like, how do they know that they're not speaking too loud, right? How can they get a good sense of what their volume's like, or even how can they get a good sense of how far away someone is? And especially when they start to navigate the robot, right? How do we let them do that in a way that's both safe but also intuitive enough for them from a distance? So there's a lot of design problems there. And then of course you've got all of the other aspects, just the hardcore technology aspects of you need to get the video feed, and that requires so much bandwidth, and you want the latency to be low, and there are a lot of requirements, right? The robot needs power, it needs to charge. What does it do if it loses Wi-Fi? Does it just freeze where it's at? Does it try to find Wi-Fi? Those kinds of things. You've got to think about all of that when you design this. So it stretches beyond just the user experience of, I'm using the telepresence robot from remotely and you're interacting with it, in person. You've also got to think about, how does the person who takes care of the telepresence robot interact with it? How do they know when to tell it to go to its charging base? Or, how does it inform them that it needs this or that? So there's that whole other side of the design, right? And that's really interesting. You also get some interesting issues like, okay, you can drive around with the robot, but it doesn't have any arms or anything. So you're not going to be able to push an elevator button or something, right? So you might have to ask someone to do that for you. That kind of thing comes up. So kind of whether it's a robot or just like the Cisco screens or the hypermirror kind of thing, telepresence focuses on realism and really trying to transport you from wherever you are to somewhere else. But I think a question that some people have looked at is kind of, is pushing the realism really the most important thing for the interaction? Or should we be focused more on kind of what we can add to the interaction that wouldn't be there if you were in person? So what other kind of features can we add that might be helpful to people using some kind of telepresence system? Because a lot of the realism features, we come up against kind of just hard barriers. And although we can do really amazing things with it, kind of the idea is, we might not be able to do amazing things at scale yet. And so what can we focus on that brings a benefit widespread, but maybe not as much realism? So that's an area to look at. Kind of related to this idea of being remote is a concept that I want you to know about is social translucence, is what it's kind of been called in literature. And this is talking about, if you're, let's say, working collaboratively and remotely with someone or with a group of people, there's these two dimensions of this. And it's about finding the right levels of them. So the first one is awareness. So how you make the status of one person known or visible to others that they're working with. And the other is accountability, and that's how you let the person who you're telling others about know what's being shared, right? So you can kind of imagine, like, if we're working on a document together or something, how much detail is it appropriate or useful to share with other users, right? You can kind of go from like sharing nothing really to maybe saying like, oh, okay, this person on your team, updated this file 10 minutes ago, right? Or you might say, they're currently online and they're working on this part of the program, or whatever you're doing. But you can also push it to the extreme, where you're saying, oh, they are on this line of code and they are typing exactly this right now, and you can watch them in real time. So thinking about something like a more collaborative editor, right? And all of these levels may be appropriate, but you've got to be sure that people have an awareness of what's being shared. And so kind of the HCI, the design of that is important, right? How do you communicate, first of all, how do you communicate people's statuses in a way that's not obtrusive or distracting and is actually helpful? But then how do you let people know what's being communicated to others? So that's a big area when we're talking about remote collaboration. Another thing that we also look at, kind of a fundamental thing, is just how people coordinate with each other. So when people are physically co-located, they have a lot of coordination mechanisms, verbal and nonverbal, and they'll use things like point at things. They have shared groundings, and that becomes a little more difficult when you're remote. So that's more of a kind of even domain-specific thing of looking at how people do something together when they're co-located versus when they're remote. So I want to touch briefly on co-presence. This is the idea of people are in the same physical space, but we're going to use technology to kind of help them collaborate or work together. One thing that this can be about is kind of just capitalizing on people's sense of awareness. So we generally keep some awareness about what's going on around us. So we have a peripheral awareness that's of kind of the social context around us. So we do keep track of, who's in our environment and kind of some social attributes about them. We keep track of if our boss is in the room versus if a friend of ours is in the room, right? Or, if we're in somewhere with our parents or our grandparents or someone we know versus someone we do know or don't know. These all affect kind of how we behave, and we keep an awareness of that as it goes on. And we also keep a situational awareness, which is, just knowing what's moving where in the environment and kind of having a little bit of a prediction loop going there in case there's something we need to respond to. So those are things to think about as we think about these kind of technologies that people will use together when they're co-located. So this is an example from the Interaction Design book. And this is an interface that shows a floor plan of an office and kind of gives the status of the people in the office, where they are, can show you, who's got a conference room booked, maybe the agenda for the day, that kind of thing. So this is a tool that's for the people that share this environment, right, to help them organize that and kind of keep track of what's going on. Another example that's quite different from the office environment, this is an augmented reality sandbox. This is also from the Interaction Design book. And so you can see you've got multiple people can interact with this exhibit, which has got sand and it's got a projection on it, and it's sensing how people are moving the sand to change the projection. Kind of a collaborative environment. And so we see other things we've talked about in other lectures, shared interactive displays. We've looked at things like the table that keeps track of who's talking. Yeah, this does look like fun. I've never. I don't think I've played with one of these in person. I don't think I've seen like things being projected on sand anywhere. But I would like to mess with that. But yeah, so a lot of different collaborative technologies that you can come up with, and kind of we follow the basic pattern, right? We see what people are doing, how we can support them best, and how does the technology really enhance that. So now I want to move on to a much different aspect of social computing in HCI, and talk about social agents. So up until this point, we've kind of mostly referred to the technology as either being a tool or a utility, a service, to help us communicate with each other, to help us distribute a message, or to bring us to a remote location. But we really need to think about the technology itself being considered a social agent, being considered an entity that you can interact with socially, which might sound crazy, but it's not. So this is a book called The Media Equation, and it sums up quite a few research studies and papers, with the kind of headline being that computers are social actors. And kind of the go-to heuristic here is that people will try to treat things in a social way with just the tiniest cues. And this applies to technology, computers and machines. It's kind of an unconscious thing. We tend to use our social heuristics and our social actions by default. So we kind of quickly adopt it with technology. We do it mostly unconsciously. It's not that we aren't aware that the computer is not a living social thing. It's that it's easier for us to think of it as one and use it in that manner. So I'll give you a couple of example studies that are discussed in this book. Something as simple as there's a study that they did where they had people they had them come in and do a task on a computer. And then they had them evaluate how helpful the computer was. And the only thing they varied was, did they take the evaluation of the computer on the computer itself, or did they take it on a separate computer that wasn't the computer that they did the task with? And the finding is that although no one can tell you why, they are more positive towards the computer if it's the computer they did the task with and they're completing the evaluation on the same computer, they'll give it a more positive rating. So when we talked about doing studies, right, we talked about how people do this with other people, right? We want to please people. We kind of want to, give them the outcome they're looking for, right? In this case, this is transferring over to just the computer itself in a very simple way, right? Very simple manipulation. As we go on and look at this more, another simple study that this group did was to have people come in, and they gave them either a red or blue wristband, and then they would pair them with either a computer that was red or blue, had a red or blue sticker on it, right? And so just by pairing people with the same color, this concept of a team gets created, and people actually give more favorable ratings, although the task was the same, the outcomes are the same, to the computers that if they are in the same color, right? If they feel that they are part of a group, part of a team. And that's a very social finding. So we can abstract this in a way, and there are a ton more studies. One of the people who did this line of research was actually got to work with him on the Survivor Buddy projects. So a lot of his work is in this book. And there are just a ton of studies that you can basically say, if it's some social finding that holds true when two people interact, there's a chance that it's probably going to hold true when a person and a computer or a person and a robot have a similar interaction. So, thinking about that, I want to think about some of the more explicit kind of social actor machines that we kind of invite into our world. So I'm going to show you this research project video, and this is for a system called Buddy.
바빠서 저희 애기 첫 걸음마 떼는 것도 못 봤어요.
Okay, so kind of interesting. Yeah, okay, so comment there, what a whimsical tune for a kind of depressing concept. Yeah, so, you know, are you too busy at work to interact with your child? Well, here's the answer, you know. So there are good things and bad things, right? We can talk about technology like this. But that's also kind of on my list of people trying to find a purpose for a social robot in the home, right? Oh, it can do everything. It can take pictures. It can create a baby journal for you. You can talk to your child, whatever. In a more realistic sense, if we think of things even as simple as like interactive toys that kids have, which are more and more complex today, you know, a lot of them are pretty much just a proxy to a cloud somewhere. We see kind of this interesting landscape where you might have a companion that is kind of an artificial computation device. And so we start to have a lot of questions about that, and if that's helpful or harmful, or, you know, what it's good for, what it's bad for, and can we even, you know, do it well? We can't do it well yet, but there are a lot of ideas out there kind of similar to the sentiment of what we saw here. And so it's something to think about, you know, how that works going forward. And people have certainly done work looking at this. There's Sherry Turkle at MIT has done a lot of work looking at like children using Furbies and kind of their interactions just with Furby toys. And that's a really interesting set of data that she's captured about that. If you're interested in that kind of thing, some of her books are very good. But we certainly see that children and adults treat these things socially, and even more so when you start to give them faces and eyes and, you know, social purpose. So I want to show you one more video. This is about a technology designed to help people kind of bolster their social skills. So this is a project from MIT a few years ago. So I'm going to play that.
When people talk to each other, the majority of the information that's conveyed comes from the way we say things rather than the words we're actually saying. Eye contact, smiles, voice modulation, speaking rate, pauses, and emphasis on certain words often add an extra layer of information in our interactions. Many of us want to improve these interaction skills, but don't have the resources to do so. Imagine if you could practice your interaction skills with an automated system in the privacy of your own living room. A program designed at the MIT Media Lab lets you do just that.
Hi, I am Mary. I'm looking forward to doing your interview.
My automated conversation coach consists of a 3D character on a computer screen that can see, hear, and make its own decisions based on its interaction with a person, and it works on a personal computer.
Now, let's get started.
Using a webcam, the system can analyze facial expressions. For example, it can measure where in the interaction you are smiling and can recognize your head gestures such as a nod or a shake. The system also analyzes your voice. It not only understands what you say, but how you say it. Using real-time speech recognition and prosody analysis, it can capture the nonverbal nuances of conversations and display it in an intuitive format. When you're done, it gives you a summary of the information, when you smiled, how fast you spoke, and so on. And it can show how these measures change over multiple sessions. It even allows you to watch the video of your interactions with various measures of your behavior displayed alongside the video, such as when you smile, how the volume of your voice rises and falls, and what words you emphasize. It even shows when your attention wanders.
I can't find you. Ah, there you are. You were saying...
In a study with 90 MIT undergraduates, the subjects went through simulated job interviews before and after receiving this training. Those who got the feedback from this automated system were rated as better candidates for the job than those who did not. Besides job interviews, the researchers say this system could help with public speaking, dating, learning languages, or helping people who have difficulties in social communications.
So that's kind of an interesting use of technology there, and it's social, but its whole purpose is to be kind of a trainer for somebody to improve their skills. In this case, the study they did was about interviewing for a job, And you could see why you might want to improve your skills, particularly interviewing skills, right? And so in this case, they're leveraging the technology that we have in terms of sensing what's going on to give feedback to a person to help them adapt their behavior. So this can be really useful, and you could see that they had like an avatar person on there interacting with them, giving them that feedback live, kind of to practice the interviewing process. So that's kind of another application we look at. So it's more of a therapeutic application almost, or just a self-improvement application, where we're leveraging technology to improve our own social skills. The question, are these ideas still being worked on? Yes, definitely. So I don't know in particular what followed this MIT project. I imagine it was someone's dissertation probably, but I'm not sure who followed them and if that person continued the research. But we certainly see a lot of these kind of coaching applications, and we do see some products, right, that are kind of self-improvement products. There are various apps, that are kind of focused on psychological well-being and fitness in that area. There's kind of this either self-guided or a remote person guiding people through like cognitive behavioral therapy through an app or an interface. So it's a big area that's still expanding, and looking at things like, does it make a difference if it's just an avatar on a screen versus having like a physical robot there or something that can, be in the environment. So there are a lot of questions that are still being studied in this area. But it's certainly an interesting area. So just to touch on a few kind of things to think about when you're designing for social computing. And this is, a lot of this has to do with, like think about if you're designing like a social feature as part of an app. So you're essentially like, you're working on kind of social network-like features, right? And some type of community where people are going to, connect from multiple places. There are these different aspects that you really want to think about, and this is its whole own course, really, to talk about kind of designing social computing. But I just want to touch on some of them. So, establishing norms. So this is important when you set up like a new community or something. How you present what the default or norm behavior is important. We kind of get that in face-to-face interactions in life, depending on where we grow up or where we're at. We kind of look around and see what people are doing and we follow those norms, right? It's really easy to do. So you've got to think about the equivalent of that when you're designing these social computing software. You've also got to think about, kind of the thing we've talked about quite a bit is the antisocial behavior that might occur on social platforms. You've got to think about how you're going to moderate or govern the content, kind of what the activity that occurs on the network. And you've got to think about, the different users, the different groups of people that are going to use it, how your algorithms and approaches are going to impact people, right? That's incredibly important. And then there's this whole other area that could also be kind of its own course. So like talking about how do you get users, how do you attract users and retain users? And whether it's a social platform with just user-submitted content that you're trying to build, or it's something where maybe it's like a fitness app that's trying to keep people meeting goals and expanding what they can do and healthy, keeping them healthy. And you want to keep users engaged. You want to attract users and you want to keep users. That's often also a big business point, right? And so when you get into that, you can start to look at different types of motivation that people have. So there's kind of intrinsic motivation that people have more out of the goals that they have, the interests that they have, things that come from their own desires, versus extrinsic motivations, which are not really based on your relationship with the goal, but maybe something like money or a grade or a degree or things that people need, and it's a goal they want to meet. But the motivation is different from I'm really interested in painting landscapes of mountains or something, right? I just like that, so that's a more intrinsically motivated goal. So you've got to balance that depending on what you're building. So the wrong mix of that can be difficult. So there's definitely like a tendency that we have today to gamify things, so like to give badges or points or things like that. If you overdo that for something that's an intrinsic motivation, that's something people do for the joy of doing it, they like the thing they're doing, and that it's kind of a self-reinforcing thing, those badges and points and things can become kind of annoying. They can harm the user experience. Now, there is a point where you do want to transition somebody, even if they're mostly intrinsically motivated. You may want to add some extrinsic motivation as you go, so you have to transition that. So that's its whole own thing, but it's things to be aware of. Kind of a few more important areas. We've got these concepts of strong and weak ties. So you can think of strong ties as people like close friends, family, people that you have a relationship with that you're going to have outside of whatever software or system you're using, right? And you'll probably use multiple platforms, multiple pieces of software to interact with them. And you'll communicate directly with them. Whereas the weaker ties, which you can think of as just acquaintances or people that you know of or kind of have seen, those are people that you usually may only interact with over a particular platform. It may be more of that broadcast style messaging, less intimate and direct feedback. So you've got to kind of consider, what is your platform or your product? Which of those kind of ties does it really focus on? So you can think of something like Facebook, right? It's pretty much about people's connections just based on social connection alone, right? Whereas something like LinkedIn, okay, people have a kind of a professional interest, right, that is shared with other users to connect them, or something like a user submitted content like Reddit or something, right? You join Reddit and you add subreddits that are things that interest you. You don't necessarily go and add people that you have close, strong ties to. So that's something to keep in mind. Another small thing to remember is that you can actually shape how users engage with other people socially over a platform, over software, which we saw with the Facebook article that's perhaps not ethical. But like a simple example here of there's this social reciprocity principle. If you do like favors for someone, they're more likely to do something for you. It's just kind of a hardwired script that we have socially. You can leverage this in an interface. And there are a lot of other social kind of hacks you can use to keep people engaged and to augment people's experience with technology. And so I'll kind of leave it with this, is to remember user autonomy is kind of important. If you truly want to avoid trapping someone or getting someone addicted to your platform in a way that's harmful to them, a lot of times you can just think about the level of user autonomy. So would the user do this on their own if I didn't promote it this way or do this or that? And you can think in more detail about that. But that's an important aspect of social computing, is to be responsible with your designs. So that's kind of a summing up social HCI for us. Some other concerns, which we'll talk about a little bit in a different lecture. So social HCI interacts with things like equality and fairness. Here's an example of a Netflix algorithm perpetuating some racial biases. So that's a really important thing to think about, and we'll talk about that in detail. And we'll also talk a little bit more in detail about things like government and politics and how HCI fits in there. So we've got about 10 minutes left, so I'm going to start talking about AI and machine learning. We won't get through it. That's okay, because our lecture on accessibility is not that long. So we'll start AI and machine learning. And we'll do a couple minutes of it now, and then on Thursday we'll pick it back up and we'll do accessibility. So I will start us off with a video.
More AI tools, deploying new AI tools, deploying new AI tools. AI tools that we deployed there weren't AI tools. Build AI tools, building AI tools, building AI tools. We will have AI tools, sophisticated AI tools, AI systems. We will have AI tools. You know, in general, I think over time we're going to move towards more proactive review with more AI tools.
Okay, I think that's funny. So those are just a bunch of clips of Mark Zuckerberg having to talk to Congress about AI tools. So Facebook's really into AI tools right now. And that's kind of a great intro and segue into, where does AI and machine learning fit in terms of these platforms that we're making, or these interfaces that we're building, and HCI principles, and how does that fit together. So we'll start. I'm going to kind of give a brief primer on AI and specifically where machine learning fits into that and how that all plays out, and then we'll look at it in the context of HCI. So if you haven't taken AI here, I would recommend that you do it. But this is kind of the textbook to go to for any questions about AI. So Artificial Intelligence, A Modern Approach. It's a really good book. Kind of has all of the basics of AI in it. But we'll start with defining AI. That turns out to be kind of a tall order. It's a little bit difficult to define AI. So here I've provided some of the definitions that this textbook, which is kind of a important one, gives in terms of talking about artificial intelligence and what it actually is. But I'm going to go ahead and just kind of give you a definition that I've kind of settled on for AI. And we can all kind of come up with ways of describing AI. There's no hard set definition. But it's definitely a broad area of study that focuses on enabling computers or machines to operate at levels that previously required human intelligence. And I think what's important to remember is that it is a broad moving target. Things that we considered AI previously, we may not think of so much as AI now that they are regularly used. So AI is kind of a flexible area. So to give you just a brief high-level summary of what's kind of included in artificial intelligence, and these are not all of the areas, but these are just some of the most important ways of dividing it. So problem solving and reasoning, this is a big area. So things even as simple as satisfying constraints. So like if you have a map and you want to color different bounded areas on the map, whether those are states or countries or counties or whatever, you can use AI algorithms to use the minimal amount of colors to color all of the areas on the map, right? I don't really think of that as AI so much, but it is. That's kind of where that comes from. Things like if you wanted to figure out where you should put cell phone towers optimally, so optimization problems, right? And looking at that, that's an AI problem. You can use AI algorithms to solve something like that. Also important in AI, representing knowledge. So this is something we don't see as much right now since statistical methods with machine learning are very, very popular and very powerful. But representing things in terms of symbols and reasoning over those symbols has historically been a big part of artificial intelligence. Things like planning, so route planning, planning to get from one place to another, how you should get there, weighing different options. Certainly learning, so pattern identifications, classification, prediction, that's where the learning really comes in. And then perceiving the world. So things like natural language processing, computer vision, so scene understanding, understanding human speech, things like that, all fall into artificial intelligence, all considered AI problems. So thinking of examples that are what I call non-ML examples, so things like just straight up search of a state space, or optimization, like for games, like predicting all of the possible game states, right? And then analyzing those and making a choice based on that. That's kind of classic AI. And then things like expert systems, which take like a series of rules and apply them to inputs to decide on a decision, to make a decision, or to produce an output. Early search engines were certainly non-ML as we know it today. And then there are even some basic conversational agents that don't use machine learning, but use more just kind of AI techniques, early AI techniques to interact with users. So I'm going to pause this here, and we'll pick up and we'll do a demo of this conversational agent on Thursday. But let me jump to kind of our calendar. So you've got the exam due tonight, so please do that. Please get that turned in. And then the rest of our week looks like this. I am going to start aligning the quizzes and making them available longer, since that seemed to be kind of common feedback, like to have the due dates kind of all the same, not have something due every day. So hopefully we'll be able to adapt that and kind of keep things lined up and give you, more time to do the quiz. So that'll be good. But that's all we've got going on this week. We'll talk about project more on Thursday, but no deadlines right now as far as this schedule is concerned. And that's pretty much everything we've got going on now. So we will meet again virtually on Thursday, and we'll talk about AI, machine learning, and we'll do a little bit of accessibility as well. So that's everything I've got. I'll hang out for a couple minutes. If you have questions, just let me know. Otherwise, have a great day, and please turn in your exams tonight.